Everybody Hawkins.
Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me if I'm this distance from the microphone? You hear me in the back? Excellent. Okay. So I'm Alan Levine, together with Tom Merrill. We direct the Political Theory Institute, the sponsor of today's event. This is our last event of the academic year. So we won't see you all until next fall, but stay tuned. If you're not on the mailing list, you can go to our website and get on it. But we have a great event to end the year. As with all PTI speakers, Nathan Tarcov has a splendid academic credentials. He is, as of this past January, officially retired professor emeritus at the University of Chicago. He's also taught at Harvard. He's the author of a book on Locke, editor of an edition of Locke's writings, co-editor of a book on Rousseau, and is co-translator of 2 volumes of Machiavelli's writings, including forthcoming Complete Tales and Poems of Niccolo Machiavelli, from which the talk today will draw. Along the way in his rich career, he also managed to serve on the policy planning staff of the U.S. Department of State, as Secretary of the Navy Senior Research Fellow at the U.S. Naval War College, as Fellow at the Siemens Foundation in Munich, and as the founding director, the only director, of the Leo Strauss Center at the University of Chicago. He's also published articles on Strauss, hermeneutics, Machiavelli, Boccaccio, Locke, the American founders, constitutionalism, democracy, and tyranny. Impressive. But unlike most of our speakers, we at PTI have a special attachment to Nathan Tarcov. He was the teacher of no less than 4 Political Theory Institute fellows. Professor Merrill and I both studied with him as undergraduates, and I don't see Professor Flanagan and Professor Hansung Lee also studied with him. And so, Nathan, I want you to be aware of your indirect influence. I had the occasion earlier this year to tabulate the number of students that have gone through Political Theory Institute programs and Lincoln Scholar programs over the course of our time here at AU. And it's over 16,000 students have attended talks that we've sponsored or enrolled in classes that we ran. And so, of course, some of those students came to more than one talk, but I'm counting as one here, someone who took an entire semester's worth of classes. So there's Professor Flanagan, who also studied with Nathan Tarcov. And so, Nathan, as you start your retirement, you talked about how busy you are right now, and that will probably persist for a while. But when the time comes for you to reflect back on your career and your legacy, I want you to know, in the first place, how grateful we all are for what you did for us individually, personally, when we were your students. But also, I want you to reflect on the influence you've had through us of our students, of those 16,000 students who have come through our events and indirectly affected by you. And now we also have several students of ours who are university professors elsewhere in the country. And so through you, the influence you've had on your students, and your students' students. So thank you for all you've done. You've been quite the ripple in the pond. And with that, please join me in welcoming Nathan Tarcov to talk about Machiavelli, poet and lover.
I think you also told me that 2 of the other speakers
this season. Bill Connor and Josh Mitchell were also students
Yes.
of mine. I am deeply grateful to you and Tom and the Institute for this invitation. I think it is, I'm not sure whether it's the same institute that it was in the past, but for this and previous invitations and for the hospitality extended.
Nathan, yell into the.
Yell, bring it closer. Is that better?
That better?
A little bit better. What's up?
Yeah, closer.
Closer.
Zoom is telling us that Tarkov needs to speak up a bit if possible.
Okay. I'll do my best. It may not be sufficient. Alan mentioned that there is a forthcoming volume, which Christopher Lynch and I are still working on, called something like the Poems, Tales, and Comic Letters, which I discussed with some of the comic letters I discussed with students who are in this room earlier this afternoon. It's not working?
It's okay, it's okay.
All right. This talk is very much related to that volume. It's not an excerpt from it, though it has some overlap with the introduction to that volume. I'll say a little bit more personally, as I did with the students, that for many years, I was interested in Machiavelli solely as political thinker, as author of The Prince, The Discourses, and The Art of War, with an occasional reference to his play Mandragola, but partly from Christopher Lynch's influence, partly for other reasons.
That is Ken.
If I can.
Hello, Ken.
I found myself taking a more serious interest in his other writings, in the letters, in the poems, and rereading and reteaching the plays. And also, especially because of the letters, taking an interest in his personal life, because this is called Poet and Lover, which I always felt it was almost inappropriate and kind of prurient that scholars are so interested in the private life, as to say the love life of every thinker of the past. Why do we need to know that? And I'll at least try and indicate that it's important. Machiavelli's case. All right, otherwise I'm going to get to my written text. It means that instead of wearing my glasses to be able to recognize you, I will take them off to be able to read the text, my text. Niccolo Machiavelli is now primarily and generally known as the author of The Prince, secondarily for students of political thought as the author of the Discourses on the First Decade of Titus Livy and of his Art of War and Florentine History. These works deserve the attention they received, but by the end of his life in 1527, Machiavelli may have been best known to his fellow Florentines instead as a former high-level civil servant and occasional diplomat, author of The First Decade, a poem recounting Florentine events from 1494 to 1504, and his comic plays, Mandragola, written around 1518 and published and produced not long after, and Clizia, produced in 1525. His now most famous political works were still unpublished, though they circulated in manuscript among his friends and acquaintances, and The Art of War was published in 1521. Throughout his adult life, he wrote poems, literary prose works, and comic plays. When in 1513 he addressed two poems to Giuliano de' Medici, then ruler of Florence, describing his imprisonment and torture, implicitly requesting his release, he complained in one poem, "Thus are the poets treated." Even in these circumstances, he presented himself as a poet, though he was imprisoned not for his poetry, but on suspicion of plotting against the Medici ruler. He signed a letter to his friend Francesco Guicciardini, also a distinguished historian and political thinker, on 21 October 1525, Niccolo Machiavelli, storico, comico, e tragico, historian, comedian, and tragedian. Historian may refer primarily to his Florentine histories, comedian primarily to his plays, but tragedian is puzzling, perhaps intended, take this apart, perhaps intended comically, perhaps referring to his famous political works as tragedies of Republican liberty. He does not, however, include Politico, emphasizing instead the various genres of his literary work. The line between Machiavelli's politico-military prose work and his literary, poetic, and dramatic works is often blurred. His Art of War is a fictional dialogue. The Prince, too, includes dialogical elements. He often addresses the reader in the second person singular, informal, or plural, formal. He reports actual conversations he held. One in chapter 3 with Georges d'Amboise, Cardinal of Rouen, and minister to Louis XII in 1500, when Cesare Borgia was seizing the Romagna, and one in chapter 7, a conversation with Cesare Borgia himself in 1503. In addition to recounting these two supposedly actual conversations, Machiavelli in The Prince also engages in imaginary dialogue, in which he presents hypothetical objectors to what he writes, his responses to their objections, and sometimes modifications of his arguments by making distinctions or even concessions to the objector. Get the wrong footnote. Some of the most famous passages in The Prince are metaphors. The doctor who remedies diseases in their beginning in chapter 3, the archer who aims higher than the target in chapter 6, and most famously in chapter 25, fortune as a river and as a woman. He describes the sufferings of Italy at the hands of foreign powers in poetic prose in the final exhortation in chapter 26, and concludes it with a quotation from Petrarch's poem, Mio Italia. His other quotation in the book is also poetic from Virgil's Aeneid in chapter 17. Machiavelli wrote poems of almost every form, epigrams, sonnets, obscene carnival songs, which I won't go into, songs to be sung between the acts of his plays, obeying various rules governing rhyme schemes and meter. Machiavelli wrote not only poems and plays, but also literary prose works, most notably his favola tale, Belphegor, the Devil Who Took a Wife, and his historical fiction, The Life of Castruccio Castracane of Lucca. Some of Machiavelli's poems treat subject matters that also figure in his political and historical prose works. His Decennale, Primo and Secondo, recounts in verse political and military events in Florence and Italy from 1494, shortly after where his prose Florentine Histories ends, to 1509. His tercets or capitoli on ingratitude, fortune, ambition, and opportunity treat themes that are important in the Prince and the Discourses in ways that bear interesting comparison with their treatment in those works. His Life of Castruccio Castracani describes an imagined prince resembling but also differing in important ways from the new prince he holds up as a model in The Prince. The subject matter of Machiavelli's plays and many of his poems, however, is love and sex, and the related matters of marriage and family. The plot of Mandragola concerns a young man named Callimaco who falls in love with or desires to have sex with Lucrezia, a virtuous, married, but childless woman, and the complicated and ridiculous modes by which he comes to spend a night with her. Advised by a parasite named Liguria, Callimaco takes advantage of the couple's desire for offspring by posing as a doctor to persuade them that a dose of mandrake will make Lucrezia pregnant, but that the first man she sleeps with will die. So they should abduct a random young man and make him sleep with her. With the aid of a corrupt friar and Lucrezia's mother, Callimaco and Nietzsche persuade Lucrezia to go along with this plan. Callimaco poses as the young man whom they abduct for this purpose. Before putting him in bed with his wife, Nietzsche makes him strip and feels his flesh, finding it, quote, beautiful, white, soft, and smooth, and examines his sexual equipment, supposedly to make sure he is healthy. Once Nietzsche has put Callimaco in bed with Lucrezia, Nietzsche feels with his hand how the thing is going. Callimaco performs so well in bed that Lucrezia wants them to sleep together henceforth. Her husband, Nietzsche, looks forward to offspring and may have enjoyed some not entirely vicarious pleasure. He gives Callimaco and Liguria the key to the house and invites them to return whenever they wish. The household is turned upside down, Lucrezia now apparently governing both husband and lover, an act of adultery, contrary to accepted morality and religion, leads to the satisfaction of everyone, a sort of common good. Machiavelli's comedy Clizia features a family in which both the father, Nicomaco, and his son, Cleandro, fall in love with or desire to enjoy sex with Clizia, the family's beautiful young ward. This premise already transgresses the moral and religious status of marriage and the family. The means by which the rival lovers hope to fulfill their desires are even more transgressive. The father plans to marry Clizia off to their servant Piero on condition that Piero allow him to enjoy sex with her. And the son makes the same arrangement with their steward, Eustachio. The plot by which Cleandro and his mother, Sophronia, thwart Nicomaco's plan may be as transgressive as the rival lovers' plans. She and her maid dress their servant Spiro as a woman who pretends to be Clizia and marry Piero, and then shares the conjugal bed with Nicomaco, who finds himself stabbed in the backside. But what he fears is Clizia's dagger, but which everyone else realizes Piero's erect phallus. Both plays thus involve the father figure in quasi or pseudo homosexual activity. The humiliated Nicomachus agrees to let Sophronia govern both Cassandra's his own affairs. So here, as in Mandragola, the patriarch, if not the whole patriarchy, is overthrown and government passes to a matriarch. Love and sex figure only slightly and negatively in Machiavelli's famous political works, in contrast to those of Plato. The prince warns rulers to abstain from the women of their subject, from the women and children of their subject. I should be correct that. Women and children of their subjects in chapters 17 and 19 as a matter of honor. Love, amore, is mentioned frequently in The Prince, most famously in his argument in chapter 17 that it is safer to be feared than loved. But it always refers only to popularity or popular affection, not to erotic love. The only mentions of falling in love in the discourses are of Appius Claudius falling in love with Virginia, book 1, chapter 40, paragraph 4, si innamoro di Virginia, and Attalus falling in love with Pausanias, book 2, chapter 28, paragraph 2, del quale era innamorato. Machiavelli's likely sources for the stories of Appius Claudius and of Attalus do not speak of their falling in love. Machiavelli makes these into examples of falling in love. In each case, falling in love leads to an ugly rape or attempted rape, and the political results are disastrous for the ruler involved. Though Philip of Macedon's error in failing to avenge the gang rape of Pausanias is his error rather than falling in love himself. Appius and the decemvirate were deposed and the Roman Republic restored. Philip of Macedon, who promoted instead of punishing Attalus, was assassinated by Pausanias, leading to the reign of his son, Alexander the Great. The chapter on conspiracies in Discourses, Book 3, Chapter 6, distinguishes between conspiracy exposed through lack of prudence and those exposed through levity, leggerezza. When you come to, quote, when you come to communicate a conspiracy to a woman or boy whom you love, che tu ami, or to similar flighty or light leggeri person. I will return a little later to Machiavelli's association of love with levity. The example Machiavelli gives of a conspiracy exposed through such levity is Dimnus, who communicated a conspiracy against Alexander the Great to Nicomachus, a boy loved, amato, by him, who immediately told it to his brother, who reported it to Alexander. Here, love leads to the undoing not of a ruler, but of conspirators against a ruler. A few pages later, Machiavelli gives the example of a conspiracy against the Emperor Commodus, who made the mistake of writing a list of people to kill the next night. Don't do that. Including his concubine or mistress, Marcia, and 2 heads of the Praetorian Guard, Letus and Elatus, and leaving it under his pillow, where it was found by a boy favorite of his while playing on the bed, who showed it to the concubine and the 2 officers, who immediately killed the emperor. It's different in Gladiator 1. Here again, the ruler's erotic attachments contribute to his assassination. Book 3, Chapter 6, paragraphs 5 and 10. Just as love and sex play little role, and that negative, in Machiavelli's political and military works, so politics plays little role in his dramatic works. Although some interpreters have offered ingenious readings of Mandragora and Clytia as political allegories, I incline to stress their surface and read them as being about erotic matters, like many of his poems and letters. Although the Italian wars precipitate the erotic events of those plays by bringing Callimaco to Paris, where hearing about Lucrezia makes him desire to see her, and by bringing Clytia to Florence, where both Cleandro and his father fall in love with her, the lovers in the plays, unlike Machiavelli in his political works, display no interest in the plight of Italy. Some of Machiavelli's poems express his own experiences of love. I will turn to these. Among the earliest poems attributed to him are several addressed to a beautiful youth whom some scholars have identified as Giuliano de' Medici, the youngest son of Lorenzo de' Medici, known as Lorenzo the Magnificent, and who ruled Florence from 1469 to 1492, from Machiavelli's birth until he was 23. These poems could not have been addressed to Giuliano after the expulsion from Florence of the Medici family in 1494, when Giuliano was 15 and Machiavelli 25. It seems that Machiavelli may have, there are a lot of scenes in these sentences, that Machiavelli may have hung out with the young Medici and their circle, sometimes called the Platonic Academy of Florence, under the tutelage of Marsilio Ficino, the great translator and interpreter of Plato, possibly meeting at the Medici Palace or the villa that Lorenzo had provided Ficino. It may, there are mays and scenes, it may have been a literary pastime in this circle to write love poems to young Giuliano, imitating the accounts of the love of young men for teenage boys in some of the Platonic dialogues, though I have not read of any other such poems by authors in that circle other than Machiavelli, or Machiavelli may actually have been in love with, or we might say had a crush on young Giuliano de' Medici. Machiavelli's biographer, Robert Black, writes, quote, "The emotions described in these poems are at the very least credible depictions of the commonplace attraction exercised on a youth in late adolescence by a young and handsome teenage boy. It is strange to think of the prince as addressed to an ex, albeit a former beloved, not a lover. The longest of these poems is a canzone of 24 lines, stressing the youth's irresistible attraction. I quote, "Your mouth and your words are the bow and arrows you have. There is not a man under the sun whom you do not wound when you shoot them. Hence it happens that you quickly, with the flutter of your eyelashes, make every mortal bound and take it. You have the mane of Apollo, shining and blonde, and the eyes of Medusa. To stone at last it turns whoever beholds you, whatever you see or touch. Both the prudent and the foolish take your sweet bait, so I do not risk giving you equally to the world." Two shorter poems, possibly addressed to Giuliano, 8 lines Strambotti, express the painful jealousy inflicted by an unrequited love for someone so universally attractive. One of them declares, quote, "I fear what I see and what I hear. Everything gives me new pain." And the other concludes complaining, "You hide a cruel heart within your breast." It is not clear whether the cruelty that the poet lover complains of is the beloved's failure to return his love, or his flirting with other admirers. If the two Strombotti are indeed addressed to Giuliano, then Machiavelli's love for him seems to have been probably unrequited and unconsummated. The longest poem that may have been addressed to young Giuliano is a pastoral, a poem about shepherds, pastore, 124 lines in terza rima, the rhyme scheme of Dante's Commedia Divina. Pastoral poems were often romantic, often about loves between shepherds and nymphs. The song Machiavelli composed introducing his play Quizia was sung by a nymph and shepherds about their loves. This poem, however, expresses the love of a shepherd for a young shepherd, in this respect resembling the iconic pastoral Virgil's second Eclogue, which expressed the unrequited love of Corydon for young Alexis, quoted by Vittori in his letter to Machiavelli, the 15th of January, 1515. Alan Gilbert, in his Machiavelli, The Chief Works and Others, titles his translation of Machiavelli's pastoral as, quote, pastoral, the ideal ruler. And he places it in the volume with the Prince and the Discourses, treating it as one of Machiavelli's political writings. There are a few lines that do attribute a sort of political rule to the young shepherd, quote, all the shepherds in these woods, without regard to youthful age, have put before you their differences. You, with your deft and lordly talent by various modes and by diverse inventions, make them return glad to their fold. A few other lines can also be read in that political way. His head is, quote, worthy of every crown and every diadem. He has a soul fit to dominate empire and kingdoms. But those lines seem to be only incidental parts of the praise for the youth's beauty, pity, graciousness, love, and brave heart, the praise of a lover for his beloved. The behavior of the poet shepherd is that of a lover, writing his beloved's name on every tree and rock. The poet lover expresses no desire, however, to make love to his beloved, only to obey him and be commanded by him, only to be allowed to recite his praises, his poetry, and see it delighted. All the poet desires from his beloved is to recite his poetry to him and see it favorably received. Paradoxically, he concludes by declaring he, quote, will conceal the love that I hold hidden, thereby openly declaring his hidden love if his beloved is to read or hear this poem recited. The next poetic expression of Machiavelli's own falling in love is at the beginning of a letter to Vittori 10 years later. What am I counting here? 20 years later. Arithmetic failed. On January 31st, 1515, where he writes that, quote, the youthful archer, Cupid, had tried already many times to wound me in the chest with his arrows. Nonetheless, they found an object so strong that little esteemed all their power, so that he, Cupid, changed quiver, changed shafts and bow, and shot one of them with such great violence that still the wounds pain me, and I confess and know his power. We see again falling in love portrayed as a painful experience of helpless submission to something external. Some 10 years later, well, what about, I'm getting suspicious of my chronology here. Machiavelli wrote a serenade of 264 lines, a triple layered love story. The poet lover tells the unnamed lady whom he loves the story, adapted from Ovid, of the shape-shifting Vertumnus who, taking the form of an old woman, tells his beloved Pomona, a nymph devoted to fruit trees with no interest in men, the story of Iphis, whose love for Anorexite was not requited, and who hanged himself in her doorway. So you have the poet and his beloved, Vertumnus and Pomona, Iphis and Anorexite. Iphis hangs himself, Vertumnus succeeds. In quick succession, we are told that Anorexite was turned to stone by the sight of Iphis, that Vertumnus turned back to a handsome youth, and that Pomona, partly from fear of incurring Anorexite's fate, and partly moved by Vertumnus's lovely face, gave herself to him and lived with him happily for a long time. The lady whom the poet loves is asked to imitate Pomona, not Anorexite, and make a happy life with her lover. So it is a serenade to begging for her love and threatening for her love. Echoed in various pop songs where I can't live without you. The poem expresses the wish of every lover for his love to be returned, and even his belief that failure to do so is cruelty, deserving condign punishment. It seems that lovers do not realize there is no obligation to return another's love, and that failure to do so is not unjust, unlike punishing such failure. This attitude may also have been present in the lament over the beloved, Giuliano, maybe cruelty in one of the Strambati discussed earlier. The final poetic expression of Machiavelli's own experience of love is the two madrigals he wrote to Barbara Salutati, a young lover when Machiavelli was in his mid-50s, an age considered older than it is now. One poem opened addressing the god love. Quote, I feel my soul burn in the fire where I gladly burn, and more than ever desire to burn. Here love is not a painful wound, but a welcome burning. He concludes promising that his beloved will be his Lord, and love his God. In the other poem to Barbara, he laments but accepts that his powers are not equal to his desire, and confesses that so much beauty deserves a greener age. Machiavelli, as he presents himself here, resembles the older lovers detested by younger lovers in Mandragola and Clizia, Messer and Nicomaco, whose names resemble their authors. I should add that he wrote songs for both Mandragola and Clizia to be sung on stage by Barbara. Machiavelli treats love or marriage not only in his plays and poetry, but also in his wonderful prose work, sometimes called Belphegor, the archdevil who took a wife, which Machiavelli simply called favola, meaning tale, fable, something not pretending to be true. It begins with a very holy man in ancient times in Florence, who somehow saw that all of the mortals who went to hell complained they were led there by taking a wife. From there, the tale launches into the tale of Belphegor, beginning with the governance of Hale, apparently a constitutional monarchy ruled by Pluto, appointed by heavenly dispensation and fateful luck in a mixture of Christian and pagan theology. Having heard that men blame their wives for their damnation, Pluto, though not obligated to any judge, heavenly or worldly, nonetheless considers it prudent to submit to laws and esteem others' judgment, and therefore calls a council of the infernal princes. He fears that their kingdom will live in infamy, will have a bad reputation if it mistakenly either judges on the basis of these claims or dismisses them. The princes conclude it is necessary to discover the truth and send one of them into the world in the form of a man. No one volunteers, so by lot they choose Belphegor, an devil, formerly an archangel before he fell from heaven, to go into the world with 100,000 ducats, to take a wife and live with her for 10 years, subject to all the evils men incur, unless he can free himself from those evils by deception and astuteness, a sort of infernal version of the incarnation. Belphegor enters Florence, calling himself Rodrigo of Castile, and displaying his wealth and liberality, with the result that many noble citizens offer him their daughters to wed. Each of you chooses a very beautiful but proud girl named Honesta, honesty or decency, daughter of a noble but poor man with 3 sons and 3 other daughters. Subject to human passions, Rodrigo begins to enjoy honors and praise, falls in love with Honesta, and can't bear to see her ever unhappy. I'll insert here, this is the only clear case in Machiavelli's works where a lover is described as wanting his beloved to be happy, as distinct from wanting to go to bed with her or him. Subject to human passion, he can't bear to see her ever unhappy. Honesta sees how much Rodrigo loves her and subjects him to verbal abuse if he denies her anything. He buys her the latest fashions, helps her father marry off his other daughters and put his sons in business, and hosts extravagant parties and dinners. Their servants can't put up with it, and even the devils he brought with him as attendants return to hell rather than live under her rule. He is forced to go into debt. One brother gambles away his property, and the other is drowned on a ship with all his uninsured goods. To escape his creditors, Rodrigo flees Florence and is hidden by a peasant named, I should say, hidden in a pile of excrement, by a peasant named John Matteo, whom Rodrigo repays by possessing women, possessing in the sense of a demon possessing, and making it appear that John Matteo exercises them. This racket works twice, enriching John Matteo, who keeps asking for more, till Belphegor finally possesses the daughter of the King of France, but threatens to get John Matteo hanged. John Matteo, however, has the king assemble a band in the plaza of Notre Dame with every kind of instrument and noisemaker that at John Matteo's signal makes an enormous noise. When Rodrigo, our friend Belphegor, asks what it is, John Matteo replies, "It's your wife coming to find you." So Belphegor, rather than live again, quote, under the matrimonial yoke, returns to hell, where he reports on the evils his wife led into their house. We should note that in his comedies, Mandragola, Clizia, the wives also rule the patriarchs, but they are much more decent and prudent women than Onesta. The contrast between Machiavelli's famous political works and his literary works include differences not only of form, but of content. I would go so far as to say that Machiavelli's thought, writing, and life were divided between the political, military, and the erotic. This division is reflected in Machiavelli's correspondence with his friend Francesco Vittore. Many of their letters are devoted to analyses of contemporary affairs of state, sometimes with ancient comparisons. An oft-quoted passage from his most famous letter, that of December 10th, 1513, which recounts his day to Vittore, beautifully expresses his transcendent joy in reading, thinking, and writing about principalities, leading to his composing The Prince. Quote, "Come evening, I return home and enter my study. And in the entrance, I take off my quotidian clothes full of mud and mire and put on my regal and courtly clothing. And reclothed vigorously, I enter the ancient courts of the ancient men, where received by them lovingly, I feed on that food that alone is mine and that I was born for, where I am not ashamed to speak with them and ask them the reasons for their actions, and they, out of their humanity, answer me. And I do not feel any boredom. For 4 hours of time, I forget every worry. I do not fear poverty. Death does not frighten me. I transfer myself entirely into them." And because Dante says it does not make knowledge to have learned it without retaining it, I have made note of the capital I have made from their conversation and composed a little work, De Principatibus, of principalities, where I go as deep as I can into the cogitations on this subject. But in a letter to Vittoria of August 3rd, 1514, only months after the one just quoted, Machiavelli expresses his transcendent experience of falling in love, as in some ways similar, but also opposed to that intellectual experience. Quote, "Neither does the sunshine hurt me, nor do the harsh roads tire me, nor does the darkness of the nights frighten me. Everything seems gentle to me, and to every appetite, even diverse and contrary to that which mine ought to be, I accommodate myself. And although I may seem to have entered into great suffering, nonetheless I feel so much sweetness inside by what that rare and mild appearance of his blood brings me, also by having put aside the memory of all my troubles, that for anything in the world I would not wish to liberate myself if I were able to. I have therefore left aside the thoughts of things great, and grave. No more does it delight me to read of the ancient things, nor to reason of the modern things. All are converted into sweet reasonings, for which I thank Venus and Cyprus, the birthplace of Venus. This experience of love led Machiavelli to renounce thinking of great and grave things, whereas reading and reasoning about great and grave things, as described in the letter of December 10th, did not lead him to renounce love. On the contrary, earlier in that same day, he read of the amorous passions and loves of Dante, Petrarch, Ovid, and other poets, remembered his own amorous passions and loves, and enjoyed himself for a while in this thought. He seems to have experienced the delights of love and those of thinking about great things as opposed but compatible alternately, if not simultaneously. Perhaps a conflict with his own soul. He thought of himself as having a soul. Machiavelli himself reflected on this duality in a notable letter of January 31st, 1550. 1815 to Vittori. The letter opens with a sonnet depicting how love has captured him. After shifting to discussion of the political prospects of Vittori's brother Paolo, Machiavelli writes, "Who might see our letters, compare, dear friend, and would see the diversity of them, would marvel very much, because it would seem that we were grave men, entirely turned to great things, and that no thought could fall into our breasts that did not have in it decency, honesty, and greatness. But then, turning the page, it would seem to him that we ourselves are light, inconstant, lascivious, turned to vain things." This mode of reading, if to someone it appears worthy of reproach, to me, it appears praiseworthy, because we imitate nature, which is variable, and who imitates nature cannot be reproved. It would be misleading to think of this division or tension as one simply between love and politics, that is, between erotic activity, practical political activity. It is more complicated, a contrast between reading, thinking, and writing about love, as Machiavelli did in the daytime in that same letter, and in some of his correspondence with Vittori on the one hand, and reading, thinking, and writing about politics, as Machiavelli did in the evening in his study, and in much of his correspondence with Vittori and his famous political writing. They both involve reading, thinking, and writing, intellectual and literary activities. Those human beings who alternate between these imitate nature, which has afflicted and delighted human beings with love, painful and delightful. Its chains light and heavy, and has made some human beings not only erotic, but political, poetical, and philosophical. Thank you.
It is our tradition to take questions first from students. I will let you figure out who a student is. And we'll ask you
I'm sure
to
they're all
speak
students.
into the microphone. Patient.
George, I'm a student here. Thank you for speaking today. I was wondering, so Machiavelli famously talks about fortune in The Prince. I was wondering if you think he learned about the concept of fortune in politics from what he experienced in his experiences with like poetry and love and unrequited love. Did you see any connections there when you looked through his poetics?
And of course, he famously says that fortune is a woman and that to possess her, etc. Omit the rest.
Can you stay at the microphone?
Stay at the microphone.
Yeah.
Okay. He famously says fortune is a woman and gives advice as to how to possess her. So there is certainly a parallel between the political and the erotic treatment of fortune. And fortune, like love, comes and goes. He does not mean, whatever he says, he cannot mean that you can conquer fortune and possess her. In chapter 6, when he talks about the greatest examples of new princes, of new principalities, of founders, they depend partly on fortune. It has to give them the occasione, the opportunity. If they have the virtue, the intelligence and daring to take advantage of the opportunity, they can do great things, but the opportunity comes and goes. You have to take it before it goes. in some sense, or if you, his discussion in the fortune chapter precedes the ending about the woman, he says that you have to accommodate yourself to fortune, to the time, to fortune. If fortune demands daring, you have to be daring. If it demands caution, you have to be cautious, etc. In the discourse, he suggests that what you can do, what an ambitious prince or would-be prince can do, depends on whether the people are corrupt or still good. What's there? You cannot destroy a republic until the people are corrupt. You cannot turn it into a principality, he said. So, fortune, the times, as he often says, the circumstances matter. I'm not sure how to parallel that exactly to the erotic quest, but your love may not be requited. In both, I think one of the Giuliano poems and in Mandragora, somebody more attractive than you may come along. I'm not sure, was that an answer to you?
I think so. Yeah. Thank you.
I think we kind of touched on this a little bit in our meeting next door, but just to ask for further clarification, can the comic letters serve a political purpose and have political influence? I know that it's you mentioned that it's they're like fanciful stories and stuff like that, but can we derive these stories about love and eroticism and apply them to political means? That's yeah. I don't know if I phrased that well, but.
No, I don't think that they can easily be applied to one another. Desire to quote, possess or to have sex with someone is not the same and cannot be achieved in the same ways as the desire to win power and glory. We do sometimes speak of somebody screwing the country or the people, but by that we mean something very different. We mean deceiving and robbing, disappointing at the least. You want
Yeah, I
to
have a
follow up?
question, yeah. So, I mean, just judging by your background, your concern is like politics. So, in examining political things, what interest did you have in, examining these letters from that position, if that makes any sense, given the fact that you, just noted that these things are kind of separate. So, yeah, thank you.
That's a good question, though perhaps it assumes too much on my part that my interests were purely political. They had been purely political with Machiavelli, but I became more and more interested in him,
Right.
in him as a man, as a person, trying to understand it. So I was interested in not the identity or allegorical identity between his political and erotic lives and writing and thoughts, but on the contrary, what this, I'm not sure I know yet, what this tension meant. I mean, how could he just months apart say, I'm in love, so I don't care at all about the ancient things or the modern things or the matters of state, and say that all he could think about is his beloved when he's in love. actually, the statement, well, the statements are in a way not identical. He says, when in love, that he can't care about the ancient and modern things. But he doesn't, when studying them, say he can't care about love. They don't seem to be exclusive symmetrically. I'm not sure how to put it exactly. In some ways, the statement being in love is stronger. He seems to, and he doesn't, like Plato, say that one leads to the other. He doesn't describe an erotic relationship that leads to political philosophy. Let's put it that way. They are, his poetic and erotic side is much more separate from his political philosophy than it is with Plato. You don't get an equivalent, say, of the education of the Guardians and Book 3 of the Republic that culminates in love of somebody with a beautiful soul and a beautiful body. This is not part of his political teaching the way it is for Plato. Yes.
Juliana Pilan, University of Chicago alumna. We have lots of degrees between us from the University of Chicago. I am hesitant to ask you this question, but I will nonetheless, because I wonder if you think that there actually is an interesting political angle to La Mandragora in particular. It reminds one of Beaumarchais, the Figaro story. And given that Machiavelli was a very modern thinker, he was one of the first to advocate for nationalism, not so called at the time. Is it not possible that what he was doing in the Mandragora is breaking down social structures? I mean, after all, we're talking about copulations among the various classes and so forth. Just a thought, just your theories on the matter would be very interesting.
Yeah, that's very good. I mean, most plays involve not only the elevation of a woman or a man, reversing the hierarchy, the patriarchal hierarchy, but of servants over masters. But that dates to Roman comedy. It's not exclusively modern, because how do we put? I'll put it as simply as possible, because such reversals are funny. They are comical. Doesn't mean that Machiavelli or parents expected in a practical way to see the master-servant and the male-female relations reverse. On the other hand, portraying it positively as leading to happiness for those concerned might encourage people to do it in some practical way. I have no degrees from the University of Chicago. My father and two of my children have degrees from that university, but I have none.
I wonder if I have two thoughts. One is to follow up on this last question. For Machiavelli, nature has to be overcome. And more than likely, we don't have guidance from nature. And is it possible that what's going on with this destruction of convention is to show the lack of guidance we have in ordinary affairs. And then just a second question, very quickly. Vittori, I'm fascinated by the relationship between Vittori and Machiavelli. Didn't speak about those parts of their correspondence where they talk like naughty boys of the kinds of escapades they had in order to satisfy their desires time to time.
Yeah. I think earlier in the afternoon, I think one of the students asked about friendship. And friendship as such, I think, is not mentioned in the correspondence, but one's tempted, though some scholars resist the temptation, one's tempted to think of the correspondence itself as a modeling or an exemplification of at least a kind of friendship. I'm going to repeat things I said in response to students. They don't have to listen. That's some friendship. If the Vittori Machiavelli correspondence is an exemplification rather than a discussion of friendship, then friendship would seem to be listening to your friend complaining about his love life and giving him sympathy and good advice and suggesting he should imitate what you did. This is very similar to the treatment in Rousseau's Émile, where somewhere in book 4, after Émile has reached puberty and has gotten interested in such things, it said, now he needs a friend, someone to confide in about this, as if friendship is just a sort of offshoot of sexual desire. But it is a pity that, as far as I know, they don't discuss friendship. I can't recall a passage where it's even implicitly discussed, but it's in a sense taken for granted. Machiavelli addresses Vittori as compare, originally meant godfather, but came to mean dear friend, old pal, something like that. They are friends. They give each other advice. They listen to each other's troubles. John Najimy, in his book about their correspondence, takes a much darker line than I do, but it's very interesting. He thinks Machiavelli is constantly begging Vittori for help in getting him a job, and Vittori's always coming up with excuses to put it off. I'm so busy, and nobody in the Vatican listens to me anyway, and all that. So there may be just as there are dark sides to love, there may be dark sides to the friendship that they exemplify. You want to follow up?
I would love to hear you say more about the other part of the question, the conventional natural.
Oh, yes, right. Obviously, he thinks that erotic desire, sexual desire, is natural, and he, insofar as he criticizes the legal and moral and religious conventions that attempt to suppress it, he sees them not only as unnatural, but as hopelessly unnatural. They can't work. It's impossible. In that respect, I would say he follows Boccaccio, and he loves to quote Boccaccio. His favorite quote is, I'm going to botch this, is better to do it and regret it than not to do it and regret it. And of course, Boccaccio too mocks the religious to make you regret it. Yes? Oh, in the back. Two in the back.
Hi,
Okay.
thanks. Now, you mentioned Ficino. Did Machiavelli ever attack Ficino in his writings, or did he have a correspondence with him?
No, of course, Ficino's a whole generation
Right.
earlier or older.
Yes.
And we don't know, I mean, this whole business of that Black talks about and some Italian scholars too, Machiavelli's involvement with the young Medici is all speculative. I mean, there is some stuff in his handwriting that's there together with other things by other people in that circle. And we don't, I mean, who was it? James Hankins, maybe, wrote The Myth of the Platonic Academy of Florence. What role did Ficino play? He was pretty old by the time these guys are in their 20s, certainly. What role he played in their education. That's why that paragraph of mine is littered with seems and maybe. But no, I'm certainly not aware of any reference or let alone critique of Ficino. And Machiavelli so rarely mentions Plato. I think the only mention of Plato in the Prince of the Discourse is that two pupils of Machiavelli botched a conspiracy against some tyrants.
Plato.
What?
Two pupils of Plato,
What did I say?
Machiavelli.
No. Two pupils of Plato. Chris Lynch has written about this, about Machiavelli on Plato and Aristotle. It's all so indirect, like that story. We don't really know, but that's why it's tempting to think of Ficino as, in some sense, the teacher or would-be teacher of Machiavelli and Giuliano. I somewhat mischievously wish to be persuaded by Black's biography that Machiavelli really was in love with Giuliano. But those poems do seem to be addressed to him, though his name appears sort of modified, Giulio. And then I think the grandson, when editing Machiavelli's poems, changes it to Giulia. So to protect his grandfather's reputation. So there's a lot we don't know. It's also possible that the grandson destroyed some things. A lot of this is maybe. And Black doesn't mention Ficino in this context. I dragged him in. There's a hand way back there for a while.
Hi. You said that you started reading the letters. Sorry. You said that you started reading the letters because you wanted to know Machiavelli the man. And throughout the talk, you also talked about how love is this contentious landscape with a lot of suffering. Given that, how fair a methodology do you think it is to judge or to get to know someone based on what they loved, since it is such a contentious emotional landscape?
Well, I didn't say I wish to judge. I don't want to go to that, Barbara. I did wish to understand him better. There's something almost shocking to a political theorist embedded in the Prince and the Discourses to hear Machiavelli say, I don't want to read about the ancients or think about the moderns or those matters of state. Who is this guy? Is it the same guy? And we all love that paragraph in the letter of December 10th about him reading in his courtly clothes. But he did spend the afternoon reading love poetry and thinking about his own erotic experiences. It was the day had other parts. So I think both Chris Lynch and I were influenced by the Italian scholar, I'm forgetting her name, who writes about these same letters we picked under the title the comic letters. So partly we were interested in him as a comico. The letters do represent his comic side. So there were multiple motives in turning to them. And once I turned to them, they were just fascinating. But the motive of doing so is more complicated. Gordon, you were.
There's some questions.
Huh?
Wait, here's a question. Here's a student question.
I'm not a student, but I'm a younger man.
And beautiful.
So if imitation of nature is the oscillation between the political and the erotic, it seems as though to Machiavelli, the greatest hopes of the statesman, glory, can be fulfilled, but that greatest hopes of the lover, somehow eternity in the beloved's embrace, or something like this, is a fool's errand. So is this a lowering of the dignity of the erotic and an elevation of the political in his conception of the good life, or am I thinking erroneously?
Yes, you were thinking erroneously, but it's a very good question nonetheless. Machiavelli, I would say, thinks that the hope for eternal glory is nonsense. He practically starts the discourses with, there were great men in ancient Egypt, greater than all the ones we praise, whose names we've forgotten. Okay, and then there's this, book 2, chapter 5, that the Christians burned and destroyed most of the records, so we don't really know about the ancients. Or at the beginning, where he says he's commenting on those parts of Livy which survived the bites of time, or I forget how he puts it. There's no eternal glory, no eternal earthly glory. No wonder people turn to heavenly glory. It's impossible what the ambitions of the political man are at least as foolish as those of the lover.
We have a question from the Zoom chat. This is Ian Perrin, who asked, several scholars, Strauss and Mansfield included, have indicated that Machiavelli employed numerology in his writings. Does Professor Tarcov have any thoughts on the origin of Machiavelli's numerological model? Are there other Florentine authors who influence his numerology, or is this an altogether original and unique use of the tool?
Well, I went to the Bronx High School of Science, where I learned that the kids who were really good at math were a lot smarter than I am, and I gave up on that. Sorry. I can't do it. Susan, do you have any comments?
So getting back to the subversion of convention, and one convention he seems to subvert is Christianity. Belfagor, you have a this on? Okay. And Belfagor. So getting back to the subversion of convention, one convention that he subverts is Christianity. You see that in Belfagor. You've got, the traditional mode of exorcism is by a pope or a clergyman, and you've got a different sort of exorcism going on there by a virile young man. So my question is there a teaching about that in relation to, is there a teaching of virtue that's present there in the plays or in the poems that seems implicit, that might go along with what it takes to subvert convention appropriately and successfully?
I mean, he certainly is a severe critic and mocker of Christianity in practically all its forms. Now, it's possible to say he's not criticizing the essence of Christianity, he's criticizing the papacy and the priests and the friars and all that. But, he does indicate in the discourse, if Christianity were to return to its true essence, it would be acceptance of tyranny. This is not encouraging. So I'm not sure where you want me to go, but he does think that it's rules about sex are unnatural and hopelessly so, that they cannot be lived up to, and the effort to do so leads to cruelty and injustice. In this respect, he again follows Boccaccio, I would say, who does elevate nature against Christianity and other attempts to constrain I think they're not expert on Boccaccio, but there's certainly stories that seem to make that very clear.
I guess my question was, is there a teaching about virtue as attending to necessity in the plays and poems that seems similar to the prince?
Well, yes. I mean, of course, virtue etymologically is very closely related to male potency. And there's certain Callimaco at the end of Andragola says that Lucrezia discovered that the kisses and embraces of a young lover are preferable to those of an old man. That's a kind of virtue. I'll leave it at that.
We're just about out of time. One more question.
Thank you, and thanks for a wonderful talk. I was wondering a little bit about the divisions you laid out earlier of there's politics, there's love, and there's also philosophy. And I was struck by your by the citation of the impulse to just abandon philosophy, politics, the whole bit. One distinction between the two, which would bear on, I think, an earlier question, is that in politics, you don't mind using force if you may not mind using force. In love, it's a different matter, and you want to be the other person to fight your love. And that's in the middle. There's the philosophic bound, because as he describes it at the end of these sessions with the ancients or the writers, he is transferred into them. He becomes, there's a kind of union with them. There's three different kinds of things that can happen and things that would be required. I wonder what you thought about, I mean, in a way, the option of love is the least promising. For the reasons you mentioned earlier. Someone else might come along as much junior than you are, and so forth. Whereas the other things you have more in your control. I mean, the political side, if you can amass enough power to. The other thing I wanted to raise, it's connected, I guess, with more with the political side, the ambitiousness of, was raised by an earlier question about Mandragora. And one striking thing there is his citation of one biblical story. The story of how Lot's daughter seduced him into sleeping with them and, quote unquote, repopulating the world. That's a very, I mean, I think that's a true interpretation of what the story is supposed to mean, but it's also a very odd thing to be thrown into that play.
Yeah, mixing up who said what. Somebody in the past 48 hours said that the seduction of Lucrezia in Mandragola, it's not by force, but neither is it exactly by informed consent, it's by misinformed. So perhaps it applies to Lot's daughters too. Certainly the forcible rape well, in a way it's true for Parkland and who?
Virginia, that was.
Virginia. You know, she is persuaded by the threat of force and shame, and Lucrezia is. I mean, it's so strange because she's perfectly willing, if she believes the nonsense she's been told, to have sex with this charming young man, which will kill him. It's murder. Nobody, neither she nor Mr. Nietzsche. Nietzsche at one point says, but then I felt sorry for the young man. This was after having felt him up. All that. So, you know, having sex on the basis of lies, even absurd lies, is certainly, in a way, as bad as forcible rape. I think Machiavelli doesn't, or he does discuss Appius Claudius. Is that Virginia? By mixing up these women. He doesn't, there is a third prominent story in Livy where the whole business of punishing debtors with a kind of slavery was abolished because of, forgetting the name, because of one demagogue who attempted to buy and rape a beautiful boy, and they got rid of imprisonment or enslavement for debt. So important changes in Rome were made in response to various rapes or attempted rapes. Virginia, if we remember which one she is, the one that Appius Claudius raped, her father killed her.
Yeah.
To protect her from a fate worse than that. One reason why that ending in chapter 25, Prince about beating fortune like a woman, is so shocking is that nowhere else is forcible rape presented favorably. And that's obviously different from politics, where Prince wants to acquire an adjacent territory, force is eligible. Consent doesn't play a role in Machiavelli's political thought parallel to what it does in Locke, let's say.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Nathan. Thank you all for coming out. See you next year.